Thank you. Madam Secretary, did I understand you correctly to say that as you sit here today, you do not know how many human beings have died while in the custody of the department that you lead? And you, in preparation for today's hearing, you didn't ascertain that number, but you don't know it today?
I don't have an exact figure for you.
Do you have a rough idea?
Sir, what I can tell you
I'm
is...
talking about people who have died in your custody. You don't have the number?
I will get back to you with the number.
Okay. You've also said, in talking about the Flores decision, that it's a loophole. And in your written testimony, you called it burdensome court opinions. You do recognize that those opinions are based on constitutional protections, do you not?
The reference in the testimony was to a whole variety of court cases.
I'm talking about your written testimony where you spoke about Flores as a burdensome court opinion. Those may impose some burdens on you because the Constitution protects liberty and puts limitations on when the government can detain people.
Sir, the Constitution does not say that families can only be detained for 20 days.
That's what the Flores decision says, and it's based on the Constitution, is it not? And it's a law that you're required to follow, correct? You took an oath.
The Flores settlement...
Are you required to follow that law?
Would you like me to answer the question, or you want to just yell at me? Because it's up to you.
I'm asking you.
And I'm trying to answer it, so would you like to hear it?
That you respect and honor in the work of the department. That's a yes or a no.
The Flores settlement requires us to write a regulation, which we have, and it's out for public comment. We are following the law to the letter.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. You've also said repeatedly and again today that there is no department policy for separation of children. You remember you just said that?
Yes, sir. There is no comprehensive policy to separate families. You remember,
of course, that we came to receive through a Freedom of Information Act request from Open Government, a memorandum that was written to you on April 23, 2018. You've seen this memo, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, it gives you a bunch of options that the department can engage in. And the final option, option 3, says, and I quote, DHS could also permissively direct the separation of parents or legal guardians and minors held in immigration detention so that the parent or legal guardian can be prosecuted pursuant to these authorities. You remember reading that?
We have the authority to do that, yes.
That would be child separation, and it goes on to say zero tolerance. This is that, President used that term, zero tolerance, right? Do you remember reviewing that?
I do, but you're confusing a variety of topics, which I'm happy to walk you through.
And then in the memo, they asked someone, I assume it's the secretary, to pick one of the options. And option 3 is redacted. My first question is that your signature affirming option 3?
I can't see that, and I don't remember which it is, but the option that I agreed to is that we would uphold the law equally against anybody who broke it. If you were a single or if you were a parent.
I have limited time. Option 3 in this memo, written for you, which this is signed, option 3, which is redacted, option 3 is in fact the option that was provided to you that I just read, permissively directing the separation of parents or legal guardians and minors held in immigration detention. So although you've said, and this isn't a question, it's a statement, although you've claimed publicly that you didn't know anything about a family separation policy and you tweeted about it, you signed off on a memo authorizing this practice described as zero tolerance. Whether you think it's legal or not, you authorize it. And so this notion that you have no responsibility for it, you reviewed it, it was offered to you as one of 3 options, you picked it. This is what it results in, because I went to the border. This is a disgrace that belies our values as a country. And to see those children and have spoken to them and to spoken to their parents who didn't know where their children were, this doesn't reflect who we are. And I find the suggestion that it was sort of something you didn't know about when you've signed off on a memo authorizing it, a policy which does violence to our basic founding values and to our understanding that children do best when not separated from their children. And so I would ask Madam Secretary, when we passed the fiscal 19 authorization bill, there were 15 amendments that were made law that involved family separation that require the agency to do a number of things, including regular reporting, mental health services, a number of prohibitions. Are you familiar with those amendments that were passed into law and signed by this Congress?
There were amendments passed into law, yes, sir. I can't.
So I would ask you, will you commit to give me a written response as to the status of every one of those requirements that we passed and the President signed? Because my understanding is none of them have happened.
Happy to give you a status.
Thank you. And to be clear, Madam Secretary, my outrage is not at you. It's at this policy and this administration's behavior as it relates to our responsibility to continue to be a place that people can come to seek asylum, to seek refuge, to seek protection. It is the crown jewel of our immigration policy, and it has been diminished, and it has betrayed American values in the way that it's been executed. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that this article, newly uncovered memo suggests Kirstjen Nielsen lied to Congress about family separation, be made a part of the record.
Will be made without objection. Made
I'd
part of
ask
the
that
record.
this article, transgender immigrant who died in ICE custody was beaten and deprived of medical attention, family says,
Objection.
part of the record.
Part of the record.
I'd ask that this report entitled Trump's 10 cities are an enormous waste of money, there are better options, be included as part of the record.
Without objection, be made a part of the record.
This article, the final hours of Jacqueline Calmacan, the Guatemalan girl who died in Border Patrol custody, be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
I'd ask that this article, where family separation began, a case in El Paso shows Flores is the solution, not the problem, be made a part of the record.
I just said without objection.
Thank you. I'd ask this article called Careless Cruelty. Civil servants said separating families was illegal. The administration ignored us. Be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
I'd ask that this article entitled Families are still being separated at the border months after zero tolerance was reversed. Be made part of the record.
Without objection.
I'd ask that this article entitled Trump administration weighs new family separation effort at border be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
That this article, U.S. still separating families at the border when children are U.S. citizens, be made part of the record. And a report just last night or 2 nights ago from ABC News, Dying for Salvation, a detained migrant's desperate plea for medical attention, a father of 6 children who died in the custody of the United States government, be made a part of the record.
Without objection. Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Nielsen, I'm glad to see you before our committee. I'm disappointed, however, that it has taken so long to schedule this oversight hearing. This is the first time you've appeared before this committee in over a year on the job. And your predecessor, General Kelly, never appeared at all during his tenure as Homeland Security Secretary before becoming White House Chief of Staff. Much of the Department of Homeland Security's operations fall squarely within this committee's jurisdiction, and this administration has engaged in a wide range of dramatic policy changes, yet the committee has failed to conduct any meaningful oversight until now. Moreover, members of the committee have written dozens of letters to you, many of which have received little or no substantive response. As we move into the next Congress, I want to put you and the department on notice. The time for accountability has arrived. The members of this committee have a responsibility to ask hard questions of any administration and to ensure that federal agencies are acting in accordance with the law and in the best interest of the American people. That job begins today. Foremost on our minds is the tragic death of 7-year-old Jacqueline Calmacan while in DHS custody. It is important that we understand exactly what led to her death and what steps DHS is taking to prevent a similar tragedy from occurring. The fact that CBP does not conduct a full medical examination of people it holds in its custody when they come into its custody is outrageous, and it is a policy that should be changed today. But more broadly, this heartbreaking case also highlights the failure of the Trump administration's haphazard and chaotic immigration policies. For example, although the law expressly allows individuals to request asylum regardless of the manner of entry, this administration has repeatedly implored asylum seekers to come to ports of entry. At the same time, DHS turns away those who do come to those ports, forcing them to wait weeks or months before actually being able to file an asylum application. These conflicting messages create mass confusion and actually drive migrants to use dangerous routes, which some people suspect is the purpose of this policy. In September, the department's own Inspector General issued a report describing the impact of DHS's policies. The IG found evidence that the practice of turning away asylum seekers and, quote, limiting the volume of asylum seekers entering at ports of entry, close quote, may have increased illegal crossing attempts. One asylum seeker, quote, had been turned away 3 times by an officer on the bridge before deciding to take her chances on illegal entry. In other words, the administration's dangerous and chaotic policies have caused desperate people to use desperate means to find protection for themselves and their children. This has likely cost at least 1 life already, and it will likely cost many more unless we return to a more rational and humane policy. We must also conduct much needed and long overdue oversight over the department's disastrous family separation policy. At its most basic level, we have three simple questions. What made the administration think that seizing children from the arms of their parents was acceptable at any level? Under what authority and under whose direction was this done? And now, what are you doing to repair the untold damage the department has inflicted on these children and their families? Not only was this policy abhorrent and morally repugnant, it is clear that the department was either incompetent or grossly negligent in its implementation, which only compounded the trauma inflicted on innocent children and their parents. For example, DHS failed to keep sufficient records that would enable the eventual reunification of separated children with their parents. Again, this is the conclusion of the department's own Inspector General. Among other things, the IG found that DHS, quote, struggled to identify, track, and reunite families, unquote, that your agency caused confusion by providing inconsistent information to separated families, and that the department, quote, was not fully prepared to implement the administration's zero-tolerance policy or to deal with some of its after-effects, close quote. I would also ask, on what planet can a humane democratic country deport parents without giving them the opportunity to have their children with them and without maintaining records so you could identify them afterwards? The fact that this was handled so poorly and that some separated children have yet to be reunited with their parents is unacceptable. Mass kidnapping by the federal government is criminal. We recently learned that DHS piloted a family separation policy in El Paso months earlier. The fact that these issues were not identified at the time or that they were willfully ignored demonstrates a callousness and an indifference to human suffering that is simply appalling, unless it is deliberate to deter people from exercising their right to request political asylum. It is past time for a full accounting of this shameful policy. We must also look at the administration's enforcement priorities or lack thereof. Rather than prioritize for removal those who threaten public safety, as was done by past administrations, this administration has effectively chosen to prioritize everyone, and thus no one. Particularly egregious are the policy changes targeting women, children, and families. DHS, for example, ended the presumption to release pregnant women from detention, and it seeks to indefinitely detain families by overturning the Flores Settlement Agreement through rulemaking. All of this is being done despite the fact that the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and the American Academy of Family Physicians have concluded that, quote, the conditions in DHS facilities are not appropriate for pregnant women or children. Not content, close quote, not content to attack and dehumanize those who seek asylum in our country, a right guaranteed by our laws, the administration is also attacking legal immigration. It is hell-bent on stripping DACA recipients of their work permits, ending TPS protections for thousands of immigrants who have been here legally for decades, and even rescinding work authorization for the spouses of H-1B workers who have been approved for immigrant visas. DHS also has proposed to dramatically reinterpret the public charge ground for inadmissibility, which would effectively penalize individuals for receiving supplemental public benefits to which they are legally entitled. As DHS's own analysis found, it may make America sicker and poorer, and it will have a profound negative effect on the health, safety, and economic well-being of communities across America. As I stated in a comment submitted on this rule with 110 of my colleagues, the rule is an unlawful and dangerous attempt by the administration to circumvent Congress and to reduce legal immigration. The administration has been clear in its desire to cut legal immigration, especially for the family members of U.S. citizens. The President, for example, has repeatedly pushed the RAISE Act, which would cut legal immigration in half. After failing to get that bill through Congress, the administration is now seeking to accomplish its goals by creating obstacles for individuals legally seeking to come to this country. The Trump administration, including DHS under your watch, has launched a relentless attack against immigrants of all stripes. Although your department has evaded meaningful oversight until now, you can be sure that beginning in January, this committee intends to do its job in a fair but firm manner. The time for zero accountability is over, and we are determined to ensure that the department's policies and practices are aligned with the laws and with the values of this nation. Thank you again, Secretary Nielsen, for appearing before the committee today. I look forward to a substantive dialogue with you on these critical matters. Now I yield back the balance of my time.
Secretary Nielsen, the majority on this committee must think you're doing a fantastic job because they've ordered this hearing so that you could come before us and look tough and remorseless just in the time for the holidays, the remorseless secretary during the holidays. Christmas, as they like to make sure and specify. I suspect that if you still have your job, which seems to always be a big question, in 3 weeks, we'll see if you still have the same sympathetic questions when you come back. I want to start by praising this administration and the role that it's had. Because there's one thing that this administration's done better than any other administration in American history, and that is lie. I still remember the first day when the press secretary came out and said this is the largest inauguration crowd ever in the history of America. Of course, everybody laughed because there were more people at other inaugurations. And the president's own remarks, on a world stage, the UN General Assembly, he said he had accomplished more as president than anyone before him. And the world laughed because the evidence was plain to see that that just wasn't true. But specifically in the area of Homeland Security, lying has become elevated to an astounding level of mendacity. President Trump descended the golden escalators at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy by saying Mexico was sending us the worst rapists, murderers. Then he said he was required to break up migrant families because of bad laws that the Democrats gave us. How about the one about Mexico paying for the wall? You want $5 million and you want $5 billion and you want the American public to pay for it. Isn't Mexico supposed to pay for it? Wasn't that the campaign promise? No, that's just another lie. And all about the ones about the massive invasion via the immigrant caravan that would ruin America. How about when Trump said, good people among the Nazis and white supremacists demonstrating? That time nobody was laughing, but the evidence was plain to see, and these are gigantic lies. I remember when the CHC met with your predecessor, your boss now, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, and he dropped a few whoppers himself. The most memorable for me is when he sat, I want everybody, because you weren't there, when he sat with the Hispanic Congressional Caucus in the Capitol in a room full of Hispanic members of Congress, most of whose parents and grandparents were immigrants that didn't speak English when they came here. And he said to us, and he looked us in the eyes and he said, the reason we can't have too many poor, uneducated Latinos in America is because they will never assimilate into American culture like previous waves of immigrants, referring to the Irish, the Italians, and the Norwegians. I would not assimilate. The members of Congress, duly elected, would not assimilate. So we couldn't have more. He said that to us. It's almost as though we were invisible to him. Secretary Could told a room full of Hispanic congressmen and women that poor, uneducated Latinos, a lot like my mom and my dad, who didn't speak a lick of English, but you want to change the policy so that if you want to come to this country, you have to speak English, would never fit, and that their children could never acquire the position of members of the Congress of the United States in this democracy. A lie, because it's happened time and time again. It is as you can't see the reality of modern immigration or contributions of anyone who came from countries other than Norway and other parts of Europe. It's as if you and the Trump administration are blind. And you know what? It seems like you agree with Tucker Carlson that immigrants only bring danger and dirt and division. But I have to say the all-time record for lying in the face of all the evidence was a tweet you, Madam Secretary, sent out on June the 17th. And it says, we do not have a policy of separating families at the border, period. That's your Twitter account. That's what you put out. Yet you came here today to tell us exactly is your policy of separating families and children from their families. Another lie. I know I have 45 seconds. I won't take them all. But it is repugnant to me and astonishing to me that during Christmas, I like to call them the holiday seasons to be inclusive, but during Christmas, because the majority always wants to just call it Christmas, that during Christmas, a time in which we celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ, a Jesus Christ who had to flee for his life with Mary and Joseph. Thank God there wasn't a wall that stopped him from seeking refuge in Egypt. Thank God that wall wasn't there. And thank God there wasn't an administration like this, or he would have too have perished on the 28th, on the day of innocence, when Herod ordered the murder of every child under 2 years of age. Maybe I haven't gone a lot to Bible school, but I know that part. Thank God. Shame on everybody that separates children and allows them to stay at the other side of the border, fearing death, fearing hunger, fearing sickness. Shame on us for wearing our badge of Christianity during Christmas and allow the secretary to come here and lie. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. If the secretary would care to respond to any of that.
Only then to say that calling me a liar are fighting words. I'm not a liar. We've never had a policy for family separation. I'm happy to walk the gentleman through it again. A policy of family separation would mean that any family that I encountered in the interior, I would separate. It would mean that any family that I found at a port of entry, I would separate. It would mean that every single family that I found illegally crossing, we would separate. We did none of those. What we did do is uphold the laws that Congress has passed, and we prosecuted those who choose to come here illegally. As far as not being compassionate, let me just tell you what I have done. And of course, he couldn't be bothered to stay, so I'm happy to tell the rest of the committee. What we have done is we have worked extensively with the Northern Triangle countries to find ways to help vulnerable populations as soon in their journey as possible. The current system puts them at the hands of those who prey on them and who abuse them. So we've worked extensively to increase asylum capacity to help them as soon as possible. We've worked on child exploitation, including very unfortunate new crimes, which are live distance abuse, where somebody goes online and directs an abuser on how to abuse a child as they watch. That is a crime that DHS investigates and prosecutes. We have worked against traffickers. We have the first anti-smuggling, anti-trafficking strategy this January. We do investigations, we help survivors. I take personal offense on behalf of the 240,000 men and women of the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you, sir.